welcome to the International Daily Roundup from People's Dispatch, where we bring you some of the top stories from across the globe. Let's take a look at today's headlines. Russian parliament approves constitutional amendments despite widespread criticisms. Neoliberalism returns in Uruguay as new president announces austerity measures. Asylum workers in Greece strike for better living conditions for the refugees. US federal judge orders Chelsea Manning to be released. McDonald's paid leave policy during COVID-19 outbreak criticized by workers. Beginning with our first story, the two houses of the Russian Federal Assembly have passed the constitutional amendments proposed by President Vladimir Putin. The amendments include provisions that will take out term limits to the post of the president, among other things. The amendments will also bring in several socially regressive and even religious elements into the legal structures. It has received the support of major right-wing groups. To talk more about this, we have with us Anish. So Anish, can you first tell us more about these amendments and what they are?
So there are these are a group of amendments. One of the most focused upon is the term limits one, which is basically it will take out the inner row part of the phrasing of the term limits that is imposed on a presidential office or somebody who's serving as the president. Now, inner row is basically to talk about how there cannot be somebody who's serving as president in a row in different terms. So, as you know,
how many terms are
so
there?
that is not specified in the constitution as such.
Okay.
So it is often taken as two terms. Now, one of the things that is we know that before Putin served as a president for 2 terms and took a break and served as the prime minister and then came back as the president right now. So this is not uncommon for him, but he wants to do away with the, keeping himself out of the picture, becoming the second fiddle. So he probably wants to make way for continuing as the president to run again in the election that is going to come, I think, in the next year or two. But that is the most focused upon when we talk about in the mainstream media. There are other things that have come up in the amendments, the list of amendments, which also includes giving more power to decide the prime minister and the federal cabinet to the parliament. So the president. So it was usually the president appoints it, and the parliament approves the list that has been given to them, whether or not it's more or less like the way the United States works, where the cabinet is approved by the Senate. So in that sense, there is some amount of devolution of power to the parliament. Now, currently the parliament is pretty much dominated by Putin's party. So for him, that is not really a challenge on his powers. Then there are other things that come in, which is referencing God in the Constitution, and also defining marriage as a union between man and woman.
Okay.
Now, these are some very regressive measures because, to a great extent, the certain secular attitudes that was there in the Soviet Union during the Soviet Union, that was reflected in the '93 Constitution. When Russia had the reactionary, going back into a certain liberal democracy, as they were said. So this is not something that is taken very lightly, but it has gotten support within the parliament, which has pretty much which has a super majority of many right-wing groups. I mean, pretty much everybody other than the Communist Party is the right wing there. So they are pretty much happy with it. There are also other things that came up which placated some other groups as well, like the Just Russia, which calls itself a social democracy party and progressive, but approved the amendment simply because it allowed for certain economic measures like adjusting minimum wages to living wages and sustainable prices of sustenance for a person, and also to regularly index pensions to increase it as per the inflation rate. So these were measures that allowed for the Just Russia party to support it. Now, the Communist Party, in that sense, has not really committed to or against some of the, like they are happy with some of the measures, like giving more power to the parliament, the measures for adjusting wages and pensions to inflation, but they are not happy with other things, including. But they haven't really spoken about it. Their state parliamentarians, on the other hand, have spoken about several of these measures. Now, the wider opposition would be, on these matters of the secularity of the constitution, and and more than that, it is about how the constitution will then reflect on the legal framework of the country.
So where is this main opposition coming from?
So a large part of the opposition is primarily extra-parliamentary. One of the most vocal voices right now is the Left Front in Russia, and they have spoken very vehemently against most of these provisions, and especially the one where we talk about including God and the heteronormative manner in which domestic unions are to be defined. And it goes for them. Their purpose would be to actually try to stifle any further progress to this. They do not have to this series of amendments because it is pretty much creating a new set of constitution. If you look at it. So, but they do not have any representation in the State Duma, the federal legislature, or the state legislatures. So, how they're going to do it is probably something that we need to see. But one of the good things about the amendments process right now is that it is going to go through a referendum.
Okay.
Now, the referendum is also going to be dicey because they haven't decided yet on how the referendum is going to, because there are two ways that a referendum can be held in Russia. But the most common way, of course, is how the one where it requires 50% turnout of the electorate, and it has to be approved by 50% of those who turn up to the voting. And this is going to be quite interesting because all of them will have to be put in the public. There are about a dozen amendments, and they will have to be voted. Whether or not they are going to be voted in a group, or whether or not they are going to be voted as particular in different slots, is something that we need to see. That is where the question comes, because a large many people, as we know, as we have covered very extensively, have protested very much on the stagnating pensions and wages, and more than that, the pension reforms that Putin has recently pushed for, and that actually created a veritable opposition across Russia, which almost seemed like something that could have threatened if it came coalesced into a political movement. So in some ways, the constitutional amendment, which sneaks these economic reforms in, is a way to placate that opposition among the people, that disgruntlement. So if they're going to put these along with the other set of amendments and put them, offer it to the people to vote.
There's a chance they might pass.
They might pass. And that is a risk that will, risk any kind of opposition to it. But the referendum is where any opposition can actually work. And that is where, because you can campaign, you can inform the people, you can educate them. So that is what people who are opposing it can do, and they will try to do it. Right.
And are they doing it right now?
The Left Front has begun. The Communist Party, as I said, they're trying to stifle it in the state assemblies, their state legislators, many of them are, but they do not have any majority in any of the state legislators. And that is a bigger problem. They have governors, they have 2 governors right now, if I'm not wrong. But if you look at the legislatures, they are not, they're pretty much controlled or dominated by Putin's party. So it is very likely, so you need a 2/3 of ratification from 2/3 of the states or what they call as federal subjects. So there are republics, oblasts, they're all called federal subjects, and there are 85 of them. And from that, you need about 2/3 of them approving the amendments in total for that to go ahead to the referendum. Now, I think there is a general understanding that most of them will, or pretty much all of them will just pass it without much opposition within the legislature. And that is where, and if that happens, then we need to wait and see where it's going to go ahead from there. And if, because the Communist Party in that sense is well placed, it has a large cadre base, it is quite a big party in the national, as in the federal level, it controls 2 state governments. So they do have a certain, clout that they can use to, and they were at the forefront of the pension reform, on the pension reforms protest. So it is, but their non-committal nature is going to keep a certain veritable mass of the opposition outside of any kind of process to stifle the amendments.
Okay. Thank you, Anish, for talking to us. And moving on to our next story, in Uruguay, neoliberalism rears its head again as the newly elected president Luis Lacalle announced a series of austerity measures at the very outset of his presidency. These include hikes in the rates of basic public services like water, electricity, and telecommunication. Lacalle claimed that these economic reforms are measures to improve the fiscal deficit in the country, and he hopes to save $900 million by the end of his term. The proposal will lead to an increase of around 10 to 11% in the rates of water supply, electricity, and telecommunication services, effective from April 1. The left-wing opposition party Frente Amplio denounced the government for what it called neoliberal policies in face of rising inflation without an adequate salary backup. The new administration's austerity measures have received massive backlash. Uruguayans took to social media to criticize Lacalle for the price hike, calling it tarifazo. They also criticized him for not standing by his campaign promises of reducing prices of basic goods and services. Now going to Greece, asylum workers at the Moria refugee camp at Lesbos in Greece went on strike, demanding better living conditions for the asylum seekers housed there. Workers began their strike yesterday on March 12th, demanding better working conditions and humane treatment of the refugees and asylum seekers. Several asylum workers have also held demonstrations at the Greek parliament. Moria camp is a transitory camp where most of the refugees fleeing war in North Africa and West Asia are held. According to the reports, there are around 25,000 asylum seekers currently held at the camp, as opposed to its approved capacity of just around 3,000. Asylum workers have repeatedly complained in the past that the refugees are held under subhuman conditions inside the camps. Social workers and local residents have been opposing the move of the government to expand the capacity of the camp, fearing that it will turn into a permanent detention camp. Greece has been dealing with an influx of asylum seekers, especially from Syria through the Turkish border to its east. Thousands of Syrian refugees were brought to the border over the past few weeks by the Turkish government, threatening to let them into Europe unless the EU supports its invasion in Syria. Now moving on to the United States. After nearly a year spent in jail resisting federal prosecutors, Chelsea Manning has been ordered to be released from judicial custody. Judge Anthony Tringa of a U.S. District Court in Virginia passed the order stating that Manning no longer requires to testify before the grand jury. The reason given for the release is the supposed expiration of the grand jury before whom Manning was asked to testify. The order comes in the same day that Manning was moved to a hospital by prison authorities after an attempted suicide. But neither the prison officials nor the judge who passed the order have acknowledged this fact. This order also does not explain how the jury expired a day ahead of Manning's scheduled hearing today. Manning has been in prison almost continuously since March 8, 2019, after she twice refused to cooperate with federal prosecutors. Prosecutors had summoned her as a witness in the secretive indictment of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. Manning was held at the Alexandria County Jail. She is currently recovering at a hospital nearby. Now, final story. Workers at the multinational restaurant chain McDonald's criticized the company's limited paid leaves policy in the midst of a novel coronavirus outbreak in the US. McDonald's so far has only offered extra paid sick leaves to workers either quarantined or in locations with higher incidence of infections. This policy covers less than 5% of the stores, according to the Fight for 15 campaign that is currently leading a strike of fast food workers for paid leaves in the US. McDonald's workers in several states in the US have been on strike by refusing to turn up for work since Monday this week. They have demanded an extension of their paid leaves to include the quarantine period or any kind of outbreak-related work disruptions for everyone who wears the uniform. The demands have included that the leaves be extended if a worker or anyone in the household were to show signs of an infection. Workers have also demanded that the company come up with a comprehensive prevention policy and train the managers and workers alike to limit the possibility of infections among workers. Multiple unions have identified restaurant workers and delivery workers to be among the most risk-prone groups to the outbreak, as they are more likely to be in contact with the general public. Even though the US has reported more than 1,200 infections and 36 deaths from COVID-19, restaurant chains have been reluctant to support their workers. And this is all we have for this episode of the International Daily Roundup. For more such stories and videos, visit our website, peoplesdispatch.org, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you for watching.